Let me start with a story. When I was 29 years old, I became vice president of marketing for Thomas Nelson. It was a huge step in my career, and at the time I thought I'd arrived at the pinnacle of success. I was the youngest vice president ever in the history of the company, or at least as far as I knew. But I was in over my head, or at least that's the way I felt. I was just waiting for other people to come to the same conclusion. And I struggled constantly with anxiety and fear. Anxiety was kind of the daytime version, and fear was the nighttime version, if you know what I mean. But this manifests itself in my body in two, frankly, embarrassing ways. First, I sweat profusely. And second, my hands were always cold. I mean, ice cold. So before attending important meetings, I would wear sometimes 2 t-shirts, hoping that I wouldn't sweat through both. And I strategically selected my clothing based on which colors would show the least amount of perspiration. And I would also step into the bathroom right before the meeting began and frantically praying that they would warm up before I had to meet somebody and shake hands with them. And I dreaded having to shake hands with anyone. And at some point, I realized that the problem was not in my body, it was in my head. And I was telling myself a bad story, and mine went something like this. You're too young for this job. Worse, you don't have any experience. Who do you think you're fooling? It's just a matter of time before everyone in the company sees it. And when that happens, you'll be out on the street right where you should have been all along. So that was the story that was going on in my mind. And I would never say it out loud, of course. It was just a soundtrack that was playing inside of my head. And things didn't change until I became aware of the story and took control of the narrative. And I started telling myself a different story. And I'll tell you more about that in a little bit. But I think almost every problem we experience can be traced back to the stories that we tell ourselves. And there may be a good reason for these stories, but in the end, they produce bad outcomes if they're left unchecked. For example, I have a friend who's been unemployed now for a couple of years, and this is a person who's extremely smart, well-educated, articulate, attractive, but he's basically given up in his quest to find a job, and it's really been difficult to watch him sink further and further into depression. But the worst part of it is that he's begun telling himself a bad story. He's telling himself no one wants to hire someone my age when they can hire someone younger for less money. That's the story, or a version of the story that's going around and around in his head. And my fear is that when he goes in for an interview, people pick up on this. And guess what? They follow his lead. Have you ever met someone who is young and lethargic, someone who didn't have much energy? Well, of course you have. I have too. And conversely, have you ever met someone who was old, so to speak, yet full of energy and vitality? Yeah, we've all done that too. This has nothing to do with their actual age. It has everything to do with their state of mind. And in my friend's case, he's convinced himself by telling himself this story that he's too old to get a job. I have another friend who was abandoned by her dad. And obviously, this was horrible. I can't imagine how painful that must have been for her. But she's taken that experience, which obviously was big and significant in her life, but she's created an entire narrative around it. And it goes like this. Everyone I get close to eventually leaves me. And guess what? That's exactly what happens, because she believes her story, she looks for the evidence to support it, and it influences how she relates to the men she dates. And over time, this story gets reinforced, and she believes it's the truth, and that's just how things are. But the only problem is it's a lie. She's a wonderful, beautiful girl, and there are lots of people like Gail and I who want to be around her and enjoy her company. But she discounts that kind of evidence. Why? Because of the story she's allowing to play in the theater of her mind. The bottom line is that you don't have to be controlled by bad stories. You can take control of them. You can change your life by changing your story. And I'd like to suggest 5 ways to take control of the narrative in your head. Number 1, recognize the voice in your head. You have to realize that this voice is not you. It pretends to be you. It might even sound like you. It probably, in fact, does sound like you. It talks to you in your own voice, but it's not. Maybe it's coming from your parents. Maybe it's coming from a teacher or an abusive spouse. It doesn't matter. Just recognize that it's happening. All you're trying to do in this stage is become aware that there's a narrator and he's telling you how things are, or at least how he perceives them to be and what you need to believe about reality. So recognize the voice that's in your head. Number 2, jot down what the voice is saying. This can be really helpful. It might be something like, I'm too young, or I'm too old, or I'm not very well educated, or I'm overeducated, or I don't have enough experience, or I don't have the right experience, or I can't write, or I always quit, or I'm not creative, or I always eventually fail, or I'm not very good with money. It could be literally anything, but listen carefully and write it down word for word. And by the way, you might have some stories that are positive too, like, I'm really pretty smart, or I have a great family, or I'm a good singer, or I'm good with people, or I always follow through, or I'm responsive. Notice that this voice, again, usually speaks in the first person, just like it's you. So step number 2, jot down what the voice is saying. Step number 3, evaluate whether the story is empowering. Is it enabling you to accomplish the outcomes you want, or is it preventing you from doing so? Be honest. Sometimes, I'm sorry to say, people are addicted to their problems and the stories that create them. Maybe it gives them a sense of certainty. Maybe it gives them a sense of drama or significance because they're at the center even of a bad story. But evaluate whether the story is empowering. Step number 4, and this is where it starts to get interesting. Write down a different story. I'm not talking about a bunch of positive thinking mumbo jumbo or affirmations, though those can be helpful and have their place. I'm really talking about telling yourself the truth. And often this is simply a matter of shifting your perspective or reframing the story. And I'll give you an example here in just a minute. But write down a different story. And literally, write it down. Write it down in your journal. Type it out on your computer. But write down a different story that's empowering. And then step number 5, start telling yourself this new story. Every time your inner narrator begins telling the old story, stop him. Say, no, that's baloney. Here's the truth. Then repeat your new story. And it may feel awkward at first, like putting on a coat that's too big, but if you keep telling yourself the truth, it will eventually fit and you'll get more comfortable with it. So back to my original story when I was 29 years old and feeling like I was in over my head. Once I realized that I was telling myself a bad story, I crafted a new one. And here's how the new version went. Yes, you're young. This gives you tremendous energy. You also don't have a lot of experience, which is why it's easier for you to think outside the box. God has provided everything you need to be successful in this situation. Even if you fail, you will learn something from it. You can't lose, you can only quit, and you most certainly are not a quitter. That story, that simple narrative, that reframing of the original situation, that changed everything for me. And it didn't happen overnight, but more quickly than I expected. And the physical symptoms gradually disappeared as I focused on the story rather than the behavior. And now instead of focusing on the behavior I want to change, when I want to change a behavior, I focus on the story I'm telling myself. So again, in summary, here are 5 ways you can take control of the narrative in your head. Maybe you think of these as steps or ways, whatever. But step number 1, recognize the voice in your head. Recognize that there is a narrator